So, you madmen and weird women actually did it. After years of memes and rage-filled gnashing of teeth, you all actually pressured a multi-billion-dollar Hollywood company into releasing a 4-hour cut of a movie that they never wanted to exist in the first place. I sincerely tip my hypothetical hat to you, O dwellers of the internet. You truly are a fearful, faceless horde. And all your hard work has allowed an interesting opportunity for this channel. On one hand, yes, I will be joining the infinite chorus of YouTubers raising their voices to critique the Snyder Cut in their own quote-unquote unique way. But on the other hand, given that this channel is completely based around editing and writing, we now have the rare opportunity to look at the exact editing choices made between the Whedon cut of Justice League and the Snyder cut of Justice League. This isn't a situation where we have to guess about the intent of the director or interpret the messages of the writing. We just have two completely different movies telling the same story. All we have to do now is compare and contrast. However, instead of diving into every single difference between the films, and there are plenty, I wanted to focus on the writing change that I felt was among the most consequential: Steppenwolf. And I guess borderline paradoxically, the Snyder Cut achieved this consequential change by doing literally the bare minimum when it comes to writing villains. That's actually my goal today with this video, mainly to highlight the differences between Whedon's Steppenwolf and Snyder's Steppenwolf, and how the tiniest bit of effort in the right direction can pay dividends when writing a villain. Many of you might be having questions and struggles when writing your own villains, or perhaps you are just interested in what writing techniques makes you invested in a villain in the first place. Well, buckle up, because we are going to go through a whole bunch of writing terms, a whole bunch of DC, and a whole bunch of narrative dissection in the hopes of simplifying this complex subject. To do that though, we will need to compare and contrast our two Steppenwolfs. Let's start with Joss Whedon's as our baseline. Now, I hope this isn't a controversial statement, but the original Justice League Steppenwolf is about as cookie-cutter basic in one note as you can imagine. And that's not really even me saying this, it's the movie.
They called him Steppenwolf, the end of worlds. He lived only to conquer. He lived only to conquer. He lived only to conquer.
When talking objectively about characters, or as objectively as you can, there are a few terms that help with understanding how a character services and interacts with the fiction. For example, Joss Whedon's 2017 Steppenwolf is a static character. This is a character who undergoes no change from the beginning of their journey to the end. Now, I know that might sound like a problem or a weakness, but there's actually nothing wrong with having a static character. Batman from The Dark Knight is a static character, and it works wonderfully. The Joker, as the antagonist, is attempting to get Batman to change from his established morals and convictions, but across his journey, Batman remains true to himself. He is a static, unchanging character, executed very well. What's more, static character typing works even better for villains. Since a villain, aka an antagonist, exists to stand in the way of the hero, aka the protagonist, the villain often represents a particular type of struggle or challenge for the hero to overcome. Often, a villain will remain static and unchanging, forcing the hero into a position where they must become a dynamic character, one that grows and alters across their journey. This is why in dozens of popular fictions, the hero and the villain face off early on, the hero is defeated, the hero changes and evolves, then the hero defeats the villain in a climactic confrontation. Still, it's important to realize that you can have dynamic villains, that being an antagonist that changes across their journey. However, that means that the conflict they present also changes, which fundamentally alters and complicates the fiction. But that is a deep topic for another video. This was all meant to say that Whedon's Steppenwolf is unmistakably static, but that is not a problem on its own. The issues arise because Whedon's Steppenwolf is static and flat. A flat character is one that has very few traits, a straightforward goal, and can be understood just from the surface level. In contrast, a round character has many traits, some of them maybe even being in conflict with each other, has a goal with a deeper motivation, and can only be fully understood by learning of their background. Now, just to make a point of this one more time, there is nothing inherently wrong with a flat character or even a round character. They are meant to serve different purposes within a fiction. A writer cannot possibly make every single character deep and complex, so flat characters usually exist as side characters with very little stake or role in the narrative. Conversely, round characters are usually the main characters, those whom you spend time with and affect the narrative. But getting back to Whedon's Steppenwolf, he is both static and flat, meaning not only does he not change or grow across the narrative, he does not have any deeper character traits or motivations behind his actions. To put it more simply, from the moment Whedon's Steppenwolf is introduced as a single-minded conqueror, we of the audience have learned everything there is to possibly know about his character. Therefore, due to a lack of character depth, we of the audience can neither relate to nor understand Steppenwolf's motivations. And the distinction between these two elements is very important, especially concerning a villain. A character's relatability is how well consumers of the fiction might see their own experiences conveyed through the experiences of the character. Protagonists and heroes are usually relatable in order to achieve the narrative function of having the audience walk in their shoes and feel the conflict alongside them. A character's understandability is how well a consumer of the fiction can rationalize and accept a character's motivations. Using some examples might make this easier to understand. Remember those opening moments to Up? Of course you do, and if you don't, please stop this video and watch that movie. It's so freaking good. Anyway, that silent montage in Up is so powerful because we can all relate to it. While none of us have lived the exact life of Carl Fredricksen, we have all probably experienced some sort of close loss or heartbreak or regret. We relate aspects of our own life to the experiences of the characters within the fiction. That is relatability. For understandability, we can turn to Thanos. Now, speaking for myself, there is no possible way that I can relate to trying to wipe out half of the universe. I can't even relate to the underlying motivations beneath it. However, because of how Thanos' character was developed, I understand his motivations. While I might not share his experiences or even agree with his reasoning, I understand how Thanos' motivation makes sense for his character, how the overpopulation of his own world has led him to think he must stop the overpopulation of all other worlds. This is understandability versus the aforementioned relatability. It's really where the term sympathetic villain comes from. You empathize with the heroes, you sympathize with the villain. And the bad part is, like I said, Joss Whedon's Steppenwolf struggles with both. He is not easily related to because, as far as I can tell, not many people take intergalactic road trips conquering planets. We of the audience do not share Steppenwolf's experience, and therefore cannot relate our own lives to his. Likewise, he is not easily understood because there seems to be no deeper reasoning for his actions. Steppenwolf isn't conquering worlds because he's motivated by a hidden yearning. He is conquering worlds to conquer worlds, I guess? There's nothing really to understand, it's all surface value. He wants to find the mother boxes and kill things just for the sake of doing them. This combination of low relatability and low understandability creates a bland, flat, uninteresting antagonist that we could see in literally any other D-list fiction. Whedon's Steppenwolf exists only in relation to his antagonism. The only character trait he has is his threat and opposition to the main characters, which is literally the lowest possible bar for a villain. This is why so many of his scenes, and even ultimately his defeat, seem so weightless. We of the audience are not invested in him because there is nothing to be invested in. And that's really all you need to know about Whedon's Steppenwolf.
I have come to enlighten you to the great darkness. I will bathe in your fear.
Okay.
Now, turning our attention to Snyder's Steppenwolf, things still weren't looking too hot coming out the gate. He comes onto the scene in much the same way that Whedon's Steppenwolf did, and delivers some brain-dead cliché villain speak about fear and how threatening he is. Really, if you look at it, most of Snyder's Steppenwolf functions in the same way as Whedon's, because as characters, they aren't given much to do except fight the heroes. But where Snyder's Steppenwolf differentiates himself is in his communications with Apocalypse. And no, I don't mean the parts with shoehorned exposition about mother boxes and anti-life equations. I mean moments like this.
I fall before you. Let me make a plea to him that I may come home after I take this world in his name.
You betrayed him.
This full section of the scene is maybe 20-25 seconds, and it already does more to characterize Steppenwolf than the Whedon cut does in its entirety. But just saying that isn't good enough. Let's unpack why. As I said before, the first part of this scene is mainly exposition and Steppenwolf talking about how easy it will be to take over the world.
This world is divided. They are a primitive species, unevolved and at war with one another, too separate to be one.
This dialogue focuses on and reiterates his goal as the antagonist. However, there is a functional switch as the dialogue continues.
I saw my mistake. I slaughtered those who sought his throne.
You still owe the Great One 50,000 more worlds.
Now, the dialogue focuses on Steppenwolf, and we get much of what we were missing in the Whedon cut. First off, we are provided a motivation for Steppenwolf's antagonism. Where in the 2017 version, Steppenwolf conquered worlds just because.
He lived only to conquer.
Here, the conquering of worlds is simply the means to his true goal. Steppenwolf just wants to go home. This checks one of the most simple boxes for an entertaining character, especially an antagonist, and that is having a motivation. But this revelation of a motivation accomplishes additional functions. While we of the audience cannot necessarily relate to conquering entire planets, I hope, we can understand being homesick and atoning for misdeeds. Remember, the functional reasons why Whedon's Steppenwolf was so uninteresting was because he was both static and flat, meaning he did not change and his character traits were face value. This then led to Whedon's Steppenwolf having low relatability and low understandability, meaning we could not empathize or sympathize with his position. However, Snyder's Steppenwolf changes this up. While he is static, he is no longer flat because we are presented with the underlying reasons for his motivations. This in turn makes him more understandable. Similarly, while the exposition was still pretty obtrusive and blatant, we also get the information that Steppenwolf has gone through a character transformation in the past.
Mighty Steppenwolf, who might have sat here by the side of the Great One, but undone by his self-pride.
This is actually pretty interesting because, again, while Steppenwolf is for sure a static character during the events of the Snyder Cut, we are given the details that he was a dynamic character beforehand. He was loyal to Darkseid, betrayed Darkseid, renewed his loyalty to Darkseid by killing his enemies, and is now on a mission of redemption. What this does is disguise his static nature as dynamic. And one of the last functionalities that this scene provides is a nuanced excuse for us to like someone doing bad things. This is super common in modern fiction. We as viewers all have standards for things we recognize to be morally bad. Killing, stealing, those types of things. But what happens if you have a character that does these morally bad things, but you want the audience to care about them and like them anyway? Well, the first narrative option is to make your character do the bad things against even worse people. 18th century pirates were some pretty heinous individuals, but by pitting them against a group even worse than them, we are free to root for the pirates. Heck, this is the entire basis of Suicide Squad. We root for the villains because they are against a bigger, more evil-y villain. Moving on, the second narrative option is to make your character who does the bad things not want to do them, but have little choice in it. We see this in stories like Taken or Barry, where the character would rather not commit acts of violence, but are forced into them regardless. This second option is the route the Snyder Cut takes. While lacking some of the nuance of the previously mentioned fictions, there is a definite circumstance created where Snyder's Steppenwolf doesn't even want to be on Earth. He doesn't exist to conquer. He doesn't want to destroy planets or end civilizations. He just wants to go home. The problem is, he can't until he ends Earth. This is an extremely important distinction between Whedon's Steppenwolf and Snyder's Steppenwolf. Whedon's Steppenwolf might as well be wrinkly Space Hitler with a side of Satan. He is completely unlikable and has no redeeming qualities. And who knows, perhaps that's what Joss Whedon wanted, an objectively evil guy for the objectively good guys to beat. But with Snyder's Steppenwolf, we of the audience are given a reason and an excuse to like him. We feel bad for the dude because he kinda just wants to go home. So, to recap, the Snyder Cut uses just a few scenes to transform Steppenwolf from a flat character to a round character, disguised his static traits with a dynamic background, made him more understandable to the audience by providing an underlying motive to his actions, and created a situation where an audience is free to like him because he is forced into his morally bad behavior. And if you're wondering how all of this happened, and perhaps how to replicate it in your own writing, it's due to a narrative technique I like to call Antagonist at Rest. I've actually talked about this topic in previous videos, but this is a perfect place to revisit it. Using Antagonist at Rest is simple, yet extremely effective and more common than you might think. All that needs to happen is for the antagonist to have a scene, or even a moment, where they are not actively in opposition to the protagonist. That's it. I know that might seem too simple, so let's break down the components of writing to figure out why this technique works so well. First, let's just think about a protagonist or main characters. When a writer thinks them up, these characters can want whatever, focus on whatever, do whatever. The possibilities are endless. The only thing that they need is a goal, which then allows them to be placed in an infinite amount of circumstances as long as the circumstance contributes to reaching the goal in some way. This allows a ton of freedom to explore the various aspects of a protagonist. Their journey to the goal can make them happy, sad, greedy, bloodthirsty, pacifistic, and anything in between, setting the stage for them to be dynamic and round. But now let's consider the antagonist, because there is a much greater restriction on writers for this character. Where the creation and function of a protagonist is dependent upon choosing any goal that you want, i.e. infinite choice, an antagonist, by definition, must stand in opposition to the protagonist. In other words, the antagonist, as a character, exists to be a roadblock and a hindrance against one person or a group of people. This is a large limitation because since the antagonist's attention will always functionally resort to being pointed towards opposing the protagonist, it doesn't give much freedom towards exploring the other facets of their character. If your villain likes making crepes on Sundays, it might be pretty hard to show that if they're always fighting the hero. Just look back to some of your favorite cartoons or movies and think about how the villain only really ever appears to oppose the hero. The hero gets scenes where they do a whole bunch of different things, but the villain only ever does one thing. This is the trap that so many writers allow their villains to fall into because it happens so subliminally. An antagonist who only ever shows face to do one thing and want one thing will almost always be static and flat. This is exactly what happened with Whedon's Steppenwolf. To avoid this type of situation, a writer must actively and purposefully create circumstances where a villain gets to show the traits that they possess outside of their opposition. And frequently, this means putting your antagonist at rest, turning their attention away from opposing the protagonist. Even if for a brief moment, this gives an opportunity to explore new parts of your antagonist and round them out as characters. Marvel did this with both Thanos and Killmonger. Breaking Bad did this with Gus Fring. Heck, the entire beach episode of Avatar is antagonists at rest. And Snyder does it with Steppenwolf's communications with Apocalypse. By turning Steppenwolf's attention away from the Justice League and towards himself, we are given freedom to explore previously hidden aspects of his character. And character aspects, once revealed, are then given the freedom to grow, further educating us about the character and deepening our understanding and relationship with them. For example, listen to this exchange in Whedon's cut.
Please, we have families. Why does everyone keep telling me that? Just tell me the truth.
Please just let us go. I have a family.
Wrong answer.
The hostages plead that they have families, and then Steppenwolf comes in with some cliche villain tough guy stuff. We get pretty much diddly squat in the way of character insight from this scene. Now, let's compare this same scene to what Snyder does.
Please, we have families. Then you have weakness.
Did you catch that? It's a small change, but knowing what we know of this version of Steppenwolf, it's pretty significant. When the hostages plead that they have a family, Snyder's Steppenwolf responds with,
Then you have weakness.
Which is pretty cool to me because it relates directly back to Steppenwolf as a character. Steppenwolf's familial relationships played a huge role in his betrayal and punishment.
You betrayed him. Your own family.
I saw my mistake. I slaughtered those who sought his throne.
His family was his weakness, and this small line shows how that has shaped his thinking and how he holds that deep inside himself. And it's not just this moment that gains power from the traits that were revealed while Steppenwolf was at rest. Other little things are able to be unlocked as characterizing moments because we of the audience know what to look for. When Darkseid makes his long-awaited entrance, Steppenwolf pulls back his shining, spiked armor in reverence, revealing his true bear self, something that looks like a minotaur covered in ballsack skin. Honestly, it's pretty gross, but still, I find it cool from a narrative perspective because up until this point, Steppenwolf had been this immaculate, gleaming, sophisticated, nigh unstoppable behemoth. But in the face of his master, the nephew he betrayed, the one he is hoping to please, he is this gross, misshapen barnacle with puppy dog eyes. He is literally and figuratively vulnerable in this moment. And as the scene played out, I just kind of wanted to hug him to make him feel better. I mean, not really, because I'd never touch him. He's basically an armored scrotum, but you get the point. Even his final moments, because of our knowledge of his motivation and struggles, take on a deeper, more impactful meaning. All he wanted, probably for hundreds of years, was to go home. He had done above and beyond what was asked of him, opened a portal, was moments away from reaching his deepest desire, and eventually did make it back home just as a severed head. It's borderline tragic when considered in totality. And all this investment, this world of difference from Whedon's cut, came from just a few additional scenes. And that's why I said the Snyder Cut saved Steppenwolf with the bare minimum. It's sad that nowadays we have to remark and be impressed by, audible gasp, round characters. It should very much be the baseline in any fiction to have characters we can relate to or understand. I shouldn't have to make videos like this where I'm happy that this wax figurine of a villain was given some detail. Snyder's Steppenwolf isn't even that great of a villain. Half his dialogue is exposition.
The anti-life equation. The anti-life equation on anti-life. Anti-life.
And the next 49% is cliche proselytizing about death, destruction, and Darkseid.
I've come to enlighten you to the great darkness. Given absolution in one glorious belief, to serve him, while I build a stronghold in the name of his glory. I bring news. Before mighty Darkseid came to the throne, he says...
But even with all those flaws, he is still better than Whedon's Steppenwolf because at least Snyder's Steppenwolf is a character. For you writers out there, please do not think that giving your antagonist background and details is optional. It's the bare minimum. And if that is something that Hollywood won't recognize, let us be the change that we want to see in our villains. Anyway, that is my way too long pseudo-educational rant on Justice League. If you want to support me, check out my fantasy books on my website, link below in the description, or join the Patreon to get some cool perks. Links for that too. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.